everyone. Thank you so much for being patient with me as I've slowly worked my way back to Chicago. I think after this I'm going to stop traveling for some time, maybe like 2090. It's been a trip, and we did get a lot of snow where I was at. I'll show you pictures on Thursday. But we'll treat this like an online lecture. So I'm recording this video for you, or this audio lecture for you as well. Like other online lectures, I might pause occasionally. I did not insert an occasional pause slide in here, but you're free to pause as you need. So let's talk about gangs and organized crime. First, we're going to talk about some of the basics. So before we get into the interesting stuff about Chicago's history, I want to talk about just some of the basics of, I'm just going to call them criminal groups. So we'll look at kind of how they're defined or not defined and how they're perceived. So this might be a good place for you to kind of think a minute, get out a piece of paper if you'd like, and what do you think of when you think of gangs or of organized crime? So maybe take a minute to write down or think of a few terms, a few things you associate with gangs or organized crime. Are there any associations that are the same for both terms? Are there differences in what you associate with each term? Who do you think of when you think of a gang member? Who do you think of when you think of somebody who's a part of an organized crime group? Are they different? Are they the same? Write some things down. So how do we define these criminal groups? Like everything else so far in this class, there is no universally agreed upon definition of a gang in the United States. So how do you think that impacts how we deal with gangs? Per the Department of Justice, a gang is an association of 3 or more individuals. The members collectively identify themselves by adopting a group identity, and they use that group identity to create fear or intimidation. Part of the purpose of this association is to engage in criminal activity, and they do this by using violence to further those criminal objectives. Members engage in criminal activity with the intent to preserve power, reputation, or economic resources. Note that they engage in this violence to preserve power. This is a lot about, the same as what we've talked about before. Per the dictionary, a gang is a group of persons. Note that there's not really, a number of persons. Members work to unlawful or antisocial ends, and especially they note it is a band of antisocial adolescents. So my theater group in high school could have been a gang where we were antisocial. But think about what are common elements of these definitions. Is there anything missing? Is this confusion affect how we talk about gangs and how we perceive them? Note too that reference to quote-unquote gangs often implies youth or street gangs. Other types of gangs do exist as well, and we'll cover those in a minute. But when I talk about gangs, I am primarily talking about street gangs for this class. Looking now at more of criminal enterprises or organized crime. Organized crime groups or criminal enterprises, they're kind of interchangeable terms, are slightly more well-defined, though there might be minor differences kind of by criminal justice organization, like the FBI, the DOJ, etc. So per the FBI, a criminal enterprise is a group of individuals with an identified hierarchy, 6 or more people. They're engaged in significant criminal activity. They have extensive supporting networks. Per the dictionary, organized crime is a group of professional criminals, and they work together as part of a powerful and secret organization. So again, what are some commonalities or differences, or is anything missing? Note that organized crime groups are now often transnational, so this means that their crime activities span more than one country. So I mentioned that I would talk about some different types of criminal groups, and this I think is more applicable to gangs than it is to organized crime groups. So there are several different types of gangs that you may hear of, and the first are youth or street gangs. So youth or street gangs, like their name implies, are formed on the street. They operate throughout the United States. Now in the 21st century, a lot of these gangs are made up of younger folks, of juveniles, of adolescents, of people in their early 20s. That wasn't always the case. There are also prison gangs. So prison gangs originated within the penal system. They operate within correctional facilities. They started in prisons, they operate within prisons. Prison gangs, however, are also, per the FBI, self-perpetuating criminal entities that can continue their operations outside of the confines of the penal system. So they exist within prisons, but some of their members continue to commit criminal behaviors outside of prisons as well. There are also outlaw motorcycle gangs, or OMGs is what they're called. And this is where members of motorcycle clubs, because they have motorcycle clubs that aren't criminal, members of these motorcycle clubs use their clubs as a means of conducting criminal behavior. And the image that you see on this slide, I found online. I don't know how terribly accurate it is, but it looked really interesting, and it kind of describes some of the different patches you might see on a member of an OMG's vest. So it might be interesting to look into. And there are also neighborhood and local gangs. Now, these gangs are kind of similar to street gangs. However, neighborhood or local gangs are confined to specific neighborhoods or jurisdictions. Street gangs, exist on the street, but they may be, more nationwide. So these neighborhood or local gangs often imitate larger or more powerful national gangs. Their primary purpose, according to a lot of law enforcement agencies, is often drug distribution or sales. There are a few different types of criminal enterprises or organized crime groups as well. Note, however, as I go through these, that gang quote-unquote types are separated kind of by who their members are and how far they extend their influence, while criminal enterprise quote-unquote types are separated geographically. So we see transnational organized crime is what a lot of law enforcement agencies call it, and there may be African, Balkan, Middle Eastern, Asian, Eurasian. There's also the mafia, and then the Western Hemisphere is kind of treated as its own set of criminal enterprises. So this difference in kind of how we just break up these types may imply that criminal enterprises have more similarities between them in terms of their membership, in terms of what they do, than gang types do. This is purely interesting information, these tidbits I found, and most of this is on gangs. So if you're not interested in this, feel free to skip this slide, but I thought it was something interesting to learn about. So there are roughly 1.4 million active gang members, or over 33,000 gangs in the United States. And I believe this was as of 2011, so those numbers might need a little bit of updating. Per the FBI, gangs are responsible for about 48% of violent crime on average in most areas. That's a lot. 69% of U.S. law enforcement agencies report criminal group involvement in drug distribution. Juvenile gangs, so gangs comprised of young adults or youths, are increasing, and this could be because of the increased incarceration of older members, which I'll talk about later on. Aggressive recruitment in schools, you'll see a lot of peer pressure into joining gangs, and youths are vulnerable or susceptible to influence, perhaps more so than adults. So we see this increase in young folks joining gangs. So why do people join criminal groups? Think about why you might join a club or a social activity, and perhaps just jot some notes down. Why would you join a club or a social activity? You might join it for a sense of group belonging. So people might join gangs or organized crime enterprises for a sense of group belonging. They might join because their friends or peers are involved. In the previous slide, we talked about how, juveniles in gangs are increasing, and part of it might be because their friends or peers are getting involved and they want to do what their friends are doing. It's a way to earn income, particularly if you're part of a criminal enterprise that has, extensive power and influence. You might make a lot of money by being in these sorts of groups. You might also join for protection, especially in prison. So in this class, we've talked about multiple times that violence is about power, right? And a lot of people say that there can be there's power in numbers, versus individual actions. So perhaps people might feel that they have no better option than to join a gang or organized crime group. And that's a way for them to gain power, is to join this group, because if this group is exerting power and you're joining with the group, you in a sense have that power now as well. They might also join for family connections, particularly, if you're, dad, uncle, whomever, and I say dad, uncle, whomever because men tend to join these groups more than women, is in a gang, that increases your likelihood of joining that as well. So how do we perceive these criminal groups? And I just looked up thesaurus sort of synonyms for gang member and for organized crime, and I found some really interesting stuff. So a synonym of gang member, per just thesaurus.com, you have thug, assassin, bandit, bully, criminal, hooligan, murderer, delinquent, guerrilla, and rioter. Interesting terms. Some of those seem a little offensive, if I do say so. And then you have synonyms of organized crime: mob, black hand, mafia, Cosa Nostra, gangland, the rackets, the underworld. So what do you notice about the differences in these synonyms? Think about the types of people we think of when we think of gang member or member of an organized crime group. They tend to be two different types of people. Does that impact what terms we use to label them? You might also want to think about, do these terms match what you wrote down at the beginning of the lecture? Why do you think this is so? How do our attitudes influence how we view members of these criminal groups? So, I've lumped these two criminal groups together because they do have a lot of similarities. There are a number of similarities between gangs and criminal enterprises. But I think a number of other academics believe that there are a few subtle differences to highlight that do differentiate street gangs, especially, and organized crime groups. And the first of these is organization. Now, organized crime has organized in the name. It didn't get that way for no reason at all. Criminal enterprises have a level of organization that tends to surpass many gangs. Now, some of these larger international gangs may have an equal level of organization, which admittedly complicates the definition of a gang. It kind of blurs the line between a gang and an organized crime group. But I like to think that these organized crime groups are organized just in their nature, and street gangs kind of became so throughout history, but maybe didn't start off that way. The second difference is power. So many local gangs, or street gangs, motorcycle gangs, and prison gangs have power over their own region. So I said neighborhood gangs have power over their neighborhood. Some gangs exert power on a national or international scale. Some of the larger gangs, exert power throughout the United States, maybe between the United States and Mexico, United States and Latin America. However, that's not most gangs or a lot of gangs. Most criminal enterprises have been operating on a global scale since the late 20th century, so since the 1980s, 1990s. There's a really great TED Talk in the supplemental links folder on Blackboard that talks about the globalization of crime groups. I think it's called The Real Story of McMafia. So if you're interested in kind of exploring how these crime groups have really become more globalized, I encourage you to check out that talk because it is really fascinating. And finally, perception. This was kind of covered in other slides. So we tend to perceive street gangs differently than we do organized crime groups. And so, part of it is organization, part of it is their power, and part of it's just how we think of them. So these are sort of the three main differences, I think, between these two groups. So now would be a good time to pause. I'm sorry I didn't insert a pause slide. Again, that's just the basic of these gangs and organized crime groups. But now we're really going to focus on the city of Chicago. And this map is terrible, but essentially it is a map of Chicago with details on the different criminal groups that are in it. It's an older map. The link that you see over the city of Chicago has a more interactive map, and you can see where different gangs are. Pretty recently, within the last 5 years or so, this map was created. I'm not going to click on it now for the interest of time, but I encourage you to check it out on your own. It is really fascinating. So I'm going to try to talk about the city of Chicago and gangs and organized crime in this history in a chronologically sensible order. So I'm going to try to go through, from approximately the late 19th century through today. It's a lot of time. There are a lot of things that kind of happen in overlapping periods, so forgive me if some events are out of order. I tried to keep it in order, however. Both street gangs and organized crime are covered in this section simultaneously. Their histories are closely linked in a number of ways in this city, so it's really much easier to present them together rather than separately. If you're from Chicago and are familiar with this, I apologize if this is repetitive to you. I am not from here, and I found this very fascinating when I was doing this research, so hopefully you find this really interesting as well. So let's go back to the 19th century. We're going to go to the late 19th century. So elements of organized crime have been present in Chicago since approximately the 1830s. Street gangs came a little later in the 20th century, so right now we're just focusing on organized crime groups, really. Contrary to popular opinion, Prohibition did not result in the establishment of organized crime in Chicago. Chicago was built on a swamp. So a fun fact, the name Chicago comes from Chautauqua, which is the Miami, Illinois American Indian term for the area. And it means smelly onion because this was a swamp. where smelly onions grow. Because of this, it was decided that in the 1850s, the city would be jacked up 10 feet and that the city would rest on stilts. So criminals in this area took their activities to the literal underworld under these stilts in rooms and tunnels beneath the city. So the underworld arose in the near north side, or what is now known as the near north side, and was at the time made up of Irish immigrants who were poor and looking for work. High-ranking ward bosses would pick young and desperate men to do their dirty work to sway elections, thus beginning the relationship between politicians, businessmen, and gangs and criminals in the city. Ward bosses and corrupt politicians mentored these early groups to create organized crime empires, two of which might have been known as the Dookies and Shielders. And these were named social athletic clubs because this lent an air of legitimacy. Because obviously you can't go out and be like, Patty O'Brien's crime group. That's not going to work. You got to call it a social athletic club because then you kind of fly under the radar. Sicilian immigrants arrived to what is now known as Goose Island in the 1880s, about 20 years after the Irish did. And they moved to an area called Little Hell. This area was a site of dirty, garbage-filled streets. There was no street lighting, and street gangs formed. As Sicilian youth grew up on these streets, they joined the Irish in petty crimes. However, my apologies, I had to pause for a minute. Differences would appear between Irish gang members and Sicilian gang members, as those who remembered the mafia of the old country or of Italy offered their services to landowners for a fee in exchange for the removal of other thieves. So one of these organized crime groups became the Outfit, which I think many people are familiar with. The images of Al Capone, a lot of people know about him. So the Chicago Outfit is the city's branch of the American Mafia. While its beginnings stem from Italian immigrants of the late 19th and early 20th centuries, as I mentioned previously, its modern organization dates to the beer wars of Prohibition, which is where a lot of people think these organized crime groups really started. So Prohibition took effect in 1919, banned the sales of alcohol, but Chicago, like many other cities, just kind of sent its liquor underground. They were like, yeah, sure, okay, whatever, we're just going to sell it underground. Before Prohibition, the Outfit focused on gambling and prostitution. However, once bootlegging joined the repertoire, bouts of murder followed as rivalries with the Irish surfaced after territorial expansion. Remember that I talked about in the Unit 2 in context that we see this intergroup violence form as different groups with different values conflict with each other. This is the case with a lot of these Irish organized crime groups and Italian organized crime groups. Different values, they conflict with each other, we see violence happening. One of these was the St. Valentine's Day Massacre. So on Valentine's Day of 1929, after about 5 years of conflict between the Irish on the north and the Italians in the south, Al Capone sent a group of men to a garage on North Clark Street, where they unloaded their guns into 7 members of the North Side Gang. The massacre drew so much publicity that the city was forced to crack down on organized crime, and the federal government joined in the effort, convicting Capone of tax evasion. So after Prohibition ended in 1933, the Outfit expanded and it focused on other criminal enterprises such as prostitution, labor racketeering, and gambling, and expanded to other states. However, they caught the attention of the feds in the early 1940s when they caught Chicago gangsters shaking down the movie industry in Hollywood. So the Outfit reached its peak in the 1960s when a frontman tried to orchestrate the assassination of Fidel Castro for the CIA. So there's ties to government there as well. And the Outfit then splintered after the arrest of these major bosses, and today we don't hear much of it. There's a nice video clip on the Outfit today. You're welcome. You should be able to click on it within the slides and not the slide video, and you can watch it on your own time. It's a short clip. So we have the Outfit. We have organized crime in Chicago. While this was going on, or around the same time this was going on, Chicago's quote-unquote democratic machine was starting to form. And you've probably heard of this term if you're from Chicago. So pre-1930s, Chicago citywide politics were built on individual politicians' personalities. Within the 1930s, this democratic machine started to form, and the democratic machine is a machine of politics that is designed to get members reelected and to hold on to political power or control. So it started in 1931 with the election of Anton Cermak as Chicago mayor. Cermak built on an interethnic anti-prohibition movement, and it united ethnic factions within Chicago. This resulting centralization of political power was the start of Chicago's democratic machine, which lasted for decades. You might have heard that one of the dailies was running for mayor. I'm not even from Chicago, and I realize that's probably not a good idea, but they're a big power player group in Chicago. The dailies came to power during the machine's peak. They dominated Chicago politics and spearheaded ambitious civic construction projects, such as the construction of the Robert Taylor projects. Between 1942 to 1970, another Congressman William Dawson, managed a black quote-unquote sub-machine on the South Side that was loyal to the Democratic Party. By the mid-1960s, however, black folks were turning to other organizations, such as the Woodlawn Organization, and the public break of black congressmen signaled a revolution among black voters. So you had this Democratic machine for a long time in the mid-20th century. William Dawson kind of took this and broke it off from that. So this revolt accumulated in the 1983 election of Mayor Harold Washington, who was the first black mayor of Chicago, and he was unable to gain cooperation from the old party. By the old party, I mean old white guys, and was continuously flouted by white politicians in the city. Sound familiar? Remember our last president? Clearly things have not changed a whole lot. But the Democratic machine remains very influential in Chicago politics today, and a lot of this influences how crime occurs in this city. So let's talk about, we talked about white people for a while. Let's talk about other people. So there were black people did not always live in Chicago in large numbers, or in the large numbers that they do now. There were two waves of black migration to Chicago. So the first wave, also known as the Great Migration, happened post-World War I, and this brought black people from urban southern communities to Chicago, where they moved into what is known as the Black Belt, and they did pretty well. The second wave occurred post-World War II, and this contrasted to the first wave, and this brought people from the rural South who were pushed off their lands to the North, seeking a better way of life. These migrants, however, fared poorer than those of the Great Migration. The reason is because of housing politics. So as the number of black folks grew after World War II, the white folks in Chicago are like, well, we can't have the blacks take over our city. We're going to design these housing politics to keep the black population contained to certain neighborhoods. I'm not going to detail a lot of these politics here, but I encourage you to look them up on your own. Things like redlining, things like really high loans with high interest rates, or just outright refusing to rent houses or sell houses to folks, kept black folks contained to certain neighborhoods in Chicago. Similar occurrences happened to Latino migrants into Chicago, though they concentrated in different neighborhoods. So as black people moved into neighborhoods, white people left, and so did their money. I promise this is all important. It'll all come together in a minute. I told you there was a lot of stuff going on, so I apologize if you're left confused. But the Irish and Italians were not the only ones getting into the piece of the action. So at the same time as these organized crime groups were forming, black folks were getting into policy rackets beginning in the 1890s. So remember, there were two waves of black immigrants to Chicago. The second wave became what is known as street gangs, and I will talk about that in a minute. But what happened to the first? Many of them integrated, quote unquote, into middle class life, did fine, made a name for themselves, moved into the Black Belt, did great. Some of them took up criminal enterprises known as this policy racket. So in the 1900s, the first policy king, John Mushmouth Johnson, and that's a picture of him on the right, became known in Chicago as his saloon on State Street was bringing in thousands of dollars in profit. Johnson worked with leaders of the Sicilian crime outfits and with two other black men, Sam Young and Patsy King. Young brought black policy to the South Side, and policy is essentially like gambling. It's a game. You're welcome to look it up. He brought it to the South Side after Johnson's death and caught the attention of the owner of the Royal Gardens, who played regularly and brought attention of housewives on the South and West Side, so it started to spread. In the 1920s, wealthy businessmen with ties to the Chicago outfit, the Mafia, invested in black policy and brought jobs to neighborhoods suffering from the effects of white flight. So if you remember, black people move in, white people are like, oh shit, move out. The outfit was like, hey, we'll bring you some jobs. We're going to tie to your policy racket, and they brought jobs to these neighborhoods. So they're tied together in the 1920s and 30s. During and shortly after World War II, the racket reached its peak as thousands of immigrants in the second wave were looking for work and found themselves involved in the policy racket. However, oops, my apologies. This is from the last slide, continuing my apologies. However, after the 40s, this kind of disseminated for a number of reasons that I will talk about in a minute. So, street gangs formed after the second wave of black immigrants or black migrants moved to Chicago from the South. And I'm going to detail some of these now. So the first is the Almighty Black Keystone Nation. One of the reading excerpts that you had talked about this. It's from an excellent book. I encourage you to read it. They're also known as the Blackstone Rangers. They were founded by two men named Jeff Fort and Eugene Hairston. They tend to occupy neighborhoods in Rogers Park, the South Side, the South Shore, Woodlawn, and the far South Side. They were founded in 1958, 1959 in Woodlawn. Woodlawn was mostly white until the 1950s, in the second wave of black migration. Again, black folks move in, white folks are like, oh shit, can't deal with black people, better move out. With white flight came poverty, though, because when white people moved out, they took their money with them, and black folks in the second wave were markedly less wealthy than the first wave of black folks, so they're not bringing money with them. The founders were inspired by the founder of the Vice Lords, and they capitalized upon the civil rights movement of the 1960s. So after MLK's assassination in 1968, the Stones offered an opportunity for young black men to take out their frustrations on the city after years of discrimination. They expanded their power into the south suburbs where black families were moving in, much to the chagrin of white folks, because heaven forbid we all live next to each other peacefully. Today, there are over 100,000 members worldwide, so this is still a very strong gang. Another nation is the Gangster Disciples, also known as the Black Gangster Disciple Nation. The neighborhoods they occupy are in Lakeview, Edgewater, and the South Side. And they, like the Black Keystone Nation, had their beginnings in the late 1950s in Englewood. Like Woodlawn, Englewood was a victim of white flight and its resulting poverty. And it was a merger of the Black Disciples and the Supreme Gangsters. The Supreme Gangsters were a part of the Black Keystone Nation for a time in the 60s as Fort was looking to expand, but that quickly did not happen. So today there are approximately 30,000 members in Chicago and about 20,000 members elsewhere. So again, a larger group. Another group known as the Latin Kings, their neighborhoods are the Little Village, the far South Side, and the Back of the Yards, and Uptown. They were founded again in the 50s in the near South Side. Mexicans and Puerto Ricans were displaced by construction of the Circle Interchange right outside UIC. And so they migrated to Pilsen and Humboldt Park. They had conflict with whites in those neighborhoods because white people don't ever get along with non-white people. And it was the coming together of several groups called the Imperialists, the Coulter Kings, and the Mar Kings. And so the Latin Kings then grew large and powerful. And this was built for the protection of Latino youth against white, quote-unquote, greaser gangs at the time. Again, intergroup conflict, two groups with different values conflicting with each other. Today, tens of thousands of members in Chicago and over 160 chapters nationwide. So these are big groups started in Chicago. How do these come together? How do these relate to each other? People are joining criminal groups for a number of reasons. Protection, often against white people because we're really good at fucking with other people, family reasons, peer pressure, etc. In this case, a lot of people are joining these criminal groups for protection against other groups as they're immigrating to Chicago. Organized crime groups had their power in the early 20th century, and they dissipated by the 1960s and 70s. Organized crime groups were tied to black policy racket, which is black organized crime in the 1940s and 50s. As these organized crime groups declined, they took the racket with them because they were like, well, if we can't be successful, neither can you. And this left a lot of desperate black people because a lot of black folks, like I said, took jobs with the racket because after that second wave of migration, they couldn't find any jobs because the white folks took their money with them and the jobs with them. Interestingly, if you've been able to follow me this whole time, it's interesting to note that the rise of street gangs in Chicago seems to overlap with this decline, as well as with the introduction of hard drugs to Black folks by organized crime groups. So as these organized crime groups were declining and interacting with this Black policy racket, they actually did introduce heroin, cocaine, etc. to these young Black men who were working for the policy racket. I don't know if that's a coincidence. I don't know if that's purposeful, but it's interesting to note, street gangs started to come up as the decline of the Black policy racket brought by the decline of the Italian mafia was happening at the same time. Interesting history. So how does this impact things today? Obviously, the war on drugs occurred in the 70s, and like I had mentioned, these organized crime groups introduced these drugs to Black folks, took off, and then the government was like, hey, we can't let black people use drugs. White people have been using it for forever, that's fine, but we can't let black and brown people do it. War on drugs happened, was a massive disaster. Number of people have been incarcerated for a lot of minor issues, and people are still using drugs. That's all I really want to say about that. The prosecution of these gang bosses, because these gangs were thought to be the ones distributing these drugs, left power vacuums, and so these big gang bosses put in jail, so now there's nobody to take over, and this led to this fracturing of these gangs, and then younger folks took over. Like I mentioned earlier, more and more young folks are joining these gangs. So this changed the rules and the hierarchies and the norms. So you hear a lot of folks, a lot of older folks who were formerly incarcerated, members of gangs, say, these gangs are much different than what they were when I was in the gang. People, there's no respect, the rules aren't the same, there are no rules. It's very different. The gang unit started around the same time as the war on drugs. You're welcome to look at the effects of the gang unit and how well they do or do not do. And there were also laws in Chicago that tried to crack down on these gangs as well. They had this anti-gang loitering ordinance, and essentially young folks couldn't hang out together. It was meant to, prevent young groups of teens from really getting in trouble, but most people know that it targeted quote-unquote gang members. So it's interesting that a lot of these prosecutions of these gang bosses and of this gang unit didn't start until after these organized crime groups, largely made up of white people, disintegrated and the rise of street gangs, largely made up of Black and Latino folks, rose. Interesting to think about. You can probably picture my face right now. So now youths are the majority of gang members, and I had mentioned this earlier. How do you suppose that impacts their life trajectory? So maybe take a minute to write this down. So, gangs contribute to a lot of violence in the Windy City now, in the 21st century. According to the CPD, there was a gang connection to most of the 650 recorded homicides in 2017. Now, it's hard to really define what a quote-unquote gang homicide is versus a regular homicide because we don't always know who committed the crime and whether or not they were a gang member. So take this number with a grain of salt. Gang arrests are supposedly increasing. Some people say it's the help of the Chicago gang database. Other people say the gang database is racist as shit and it shouldn't be put up. A lot of people ask, however, why are our murder rates so high compared to other large cities? Los Angeles and New York City don't have nearly the same murder rates that we do. Well, a lot of folks say that there are several reasons. The first is displacement. So again, you have this white flight of the 50s, and that's just continued with destroyal of projects like Cabrini Green. So we set up these projects for Black folks to live in because we didn't want them to live with the white folks. Then we decided, well, those projects are eyesores, so we're going to destroy them, but we're not going to put these Black folks in new places. And so now they're left with nowhere to go. And some people think that that is linked to violence. We have segregated neighborhoods. Chicago is an extremely segregated city. As somebody who is not from Chicago, I did not think that a city could be so segregated until I moved here. It is ridiculous, which may lead to conflict. Again, repeating this over and over, when you have two groups living discreetly, not really integrating with each other, they have different values and they come together, you're going to get conflict. And then we have a history of institutionalized gangs. As hopefully the last 15 minutes has shown you, gangs are an integral, and organized crime groups are an integral part of Chicago's history, and they were an integral part of the politics of Chicago. So I know this was a lot, and it can be really confusing. I was hoping to show all of this to you in class because I think we could have a really great discussion. But again, I thank you for letting me get back to Chicago slowly. On Thursday, we'll do in-class activity 3. We're going to look at gangs. It'll be hopefully a pretty interesting activity. So I hope to see you on Thursday. Stay warm, everybody.